Good evening, I would say evening, because I'm from Serbia and here it's almost completely dark, so I'll say good evening, everyone. And first, I would like to thank you all for being here with us today. We have not more, but they're like, at the moment, we have 15 participants at the moment. So my name is Irena Djordjevic. I'm a PhD student in political science at the University of Beira Interior and the University of Aveiro. And today I'm pleased to be in the role of the moderator of this important lecture of unconditional basic income. Today's lecture is the first one within the cycle of the lectures dedicated to the contemporary political topics organized by PRAXIS, Center of Philosophy, Politics and Culture. It aims to expose and to discuss a set of political issues that today are challenges for reflection and the urgent reconfiguration of human society. Today, we are still living in a world in which every 5 seconds around the world, one child under the age of 15 dies due to the reasons related with the poverty. And still today, we have every 10th person on the planet that lives in the conditions of extreme poverty, even though the majority of them are actually those that are employed workers, which speaks to the fact that having a job does not mean that we will have a decent life. Even though the poverty prevails in developing economies, UN data actually shows that even developed countries still have a way to go in order to end the poverty in all its forms. So in such a state of, if we are discussing the perspective of unconditional basic income, it seems more than relevant. Therefore, here with us today we have Gonçalo Marcelo, as you all mentioned, you all saw already. He's co-author of a book published in Portugal on unconditional basic income and one of the founding members of the Association for Unconditional Basic Income in Portugal. Gonçalo holds a PhD in moral and political philosophy from the University Nova de Lisboa. He's researcher at the Center for Classical and Humanistic Studies at the University of Coimbra and invited lecturer at Católica Porto Business School. Gonçalo was also visiting researcher at Université Catholique de Louvain, Fondrique, and Columbia University. His main research interests are in the fields of social and political philosophy, ethics, hermeneutics, and critical theory. He's a group leader in a Coast Action on Democracy and Civil Rights in Europe. He has written on topics such as the recognition theory and more recently on universal basic income and the challenges to democracy. So thank you for being here with us today, Gonçalo. In the following more or less 50 minutes, Gonçalo will present the possibility of universal basic income in 3 different contexts. The first one is related to the recent challenges in the labor market, including the increasing precarization of labor amid the new spirit of capitalism. The second context is regarding the evolution of the European welfare states and the problems they have to tackle, including poverty, inequality, and employment, including also so-called technological unemployment due to automatization and the fourth industrial revolution, and the challenges to democracy, including its legitimation crisis, the rising threat of populism, which is worsened when the living conditions degrade. Against the backdrop, and given the insufficiencies and problem of mean-tested social aid, Gonçalo will today argue that universal basic income might be a sound policy to partially tackle this problem. So I'm more than happy to hear more about it. So Gonçalo, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much, Irena, for your extended presentation. I think you did a remarkable job. I wonder if we can just skip the presentation and go to the discussion. I'm joking. I really think it was a very nice presentation, and it gave all the context, thus allowing me to perhaps go faster in the first few slides of my presentation. So just to start, I would like to thank everyone for having me here, and namely Maria João Cabrita and the organization of these PRAXIS lectures in political philosophy. I'm very glad to meet a few friends here, namely André Barata and also Carlos Jalali. Probably you already heard about unconditional or universal basic income. I'm probably not giving you news here, but as Irena said in her presentation, I am basically doing 2 different things here in my presentation. I'm giving you a context, a backdrop of what are very well-known problems and challenges to liberal democracy today, and thus setting the stage of the problems also affecting the welfare state, which are more or less crossed into the problems affecting liberal democracies, because these social problems also fuel the challenges to liberal democracy, in my opinion. And thus I will present universal basic income as a possible policy to help solving some of these problems. And so contrary to many presentations on universal basic income, well, this is an introductory lecture. And so if any of you is a specialist in unconditional basic income, I know Andre is, but that's another worry. But so if any of you is a specialist in universal basic income, I must apologize, because I am not going into very specific details in the presentation, even though we might do that in the discussion part, of course. But I am just giving some sort of political angle on universal basic income. That is one of the other reasons, and one that is not very much discussed, I believe, why we could say that perhaps universal basic income could be desirable, okay? So I prepared the PowerPoint because I think it's better to do it with the PowerPoint when we do it by Zoom. I'm not going to read, I'm going to talk, but I'll follow the PowerPoint. I must apologize because it's nothing too fancy. It's not very appealing from a graphic standpoint. And this is because I had to do it in a rush. And so it's just a couple of bullet points, etc. But I hope it helps. Okay, and if you have any doubt or want to come back to discuss any specific point or present objections, etc., we can do all of that in the extended discussion. Okay, and Irena, it always goes like this. I always think I don't have enough to speak the necessary amount of time, but then eventually I might get carried away and speak more than what I should. And so in case that happens, please cut me off. Just tell me I have 1 minute or wherever, or that I should conclude. And
I will announce 10 minutes before the end.
Okay, thank you. And even during the presentation, and to all of you, I mean, feel free to interrupt me with doubts or questions or whatever. I take conferences like I give classes. If there's doubts, or if any of you has a clarification question or a very, very pressing question or objection you want to make, please feel free. This is a dialogue, nothing else, okay? So that being said, I think we can start. I'm just going to share the PowerPoint. Okay, I'm going to maximize it. Do you see it? Can you read it? Okay.
Now, yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my Mac is kind of slow. I apologize if there's some glitch during the presentation, but I hope not. Okay, yeah. So just to start, for the title, I eventually adopted the designation. The official designation is universal basic income rather than conditional basic income. This is a question of terminology. For those of you who might not be that well acquainted with the possibility of a UBI, of a universal basic income, I'll get to that. I'll explain what that means. Basically, universal and unconditional mean more or less the same thing, except that when we speak about unconditionality, it is a wider notion than universality. That is, universality is one of the requirements of unconditionality. And so when we say that basic income is unconditional, we are saying two things: that it should be attributed to everyone, thus it is universal, but also that it has no strings attached, no conditions for receiving it attached. It is not means tested. It does not require anyone to be forced to work, etc., etc., etc. But for reasons which I really can't explain because I am not totally aware of them, in English, the designation, the common designation is really universal basic income, whereas in Portuguese we speak about rendimento básico incondicional. But it's basically the same thing, okay? So, what is the backdrop here? Well, these are the challenges to liberal democracy, okay? And so I should start by saying that, as Chantal Mouffe, the political theorist, argues, liberal democracy is a contingent political articulation, okay? This is to say that there are several forms of democracy, okay? I have, of course, direct democracy like we had in ancient Greece, okay? We have participatory democracy, we have representative democracy, but the form of democracy that came to dominate, namely in the West, and that has been known as the Western model, then forcefully, sometimes forcefully, by means of force, that is exported or tried to export to other places of the world, is a model which we can call liberal democracy, okay? And it came to be known at some point, or it came to be credited with or believed to be more or less like the there is no alternative from neoliberalism as some sort of naturalized version of a political regime, okay? As if there would be no meaningful alternative to liberal democracy. You all know the end of history thesis, Fukuyama, and the like. But as they say it, like they say it, contrary to popular belief, liberal democracy is a contingent political articulation between two different sets of notions or of ideals, those of political liberalism and democratic ideals, okay? Political liberalism, of course, being marked by rule of law, separation of powers, and the defense of individual freedoms. Whereas in this contingent political articulation, we find some sort of mixture of crossing of these elements of political liberalism with the ideals of equality, popular sovereignty, and self-rule. And so in the Western model, sometimes taken to be the universal model, even though there is no such thing as a universal model, this model coalesced in a democratic form that is representative, as I said, and which cherishes political pluralism, which is a very important feature of the separation of powers, and which is now under threat in many parts of the world, and namely in Eastern Europe. Okay, and so the point here being that if this is a contingent political articulation, if it is marked by a certain history, I mean, there is no reason to believe that it cannot come to an end. Indeed, it can. And so it's a matter of political will to try and protect it from the menaces that might appear, or not, because you can criticize liberal democracy for its many insufficiencies, okay? Because it's not sufficiently participatory, it can be captured by technocratic practices, etc., etc., etc. But so, sorry. I will speak just a little bit about populism because I know that the next lecture will be specifically on populism. It will be given by Professor João Cardoso Rosas from the University of Minho. And so I don't want to go too much into that. However, setting this against the backdrop of the challenges to democracy, I have to say just a few things about it, okay? So one of the major threats nowadays, of course, stems from right-wing populism and the danger of an authoritarian turn, okay? Now, the reasons behind this are several, okay? There is what we could call a complex causality behind the rise of populism and the eventual danger of an authoritarian turn, as we are seeing in different countries. Now, one very significant cause is a reactionary cultural backlash that basically reacts for identitarian or resentment or other reasons against all the, let's call it, moral and social progress that did take place with many setbacks and many exclusions, but that did take place in the last few decades in Western countries. And all the ascent of, I don't know, minorities, feminist causes, etc., etc. So there's a significant cultural backlash against that. What you could call traditional card-carrying racists, so to speak, even though not all people, of course, who stand behind populist proposals can be rightly identified as, you know, deplorables, as Hillary Clinton put it. What I will be arguing instead is that there are real causes behind this discontentment and which need to be tackled. Then you have, of course, technocracy and the so-called legitimation crisis, exposing a democratic deficit. Okay, so here I am employing mostly Habermasian terminology, but you can see the legitimation crisis of democracy because of a technocratic conception of politics, the one that is behind neoliberalism and the belief according to which there is nothing specific about the political act, that politics should be driven by some form of, sometimes even arguing for epistocracy, that is rule of the knowers, you know, like we had already in Plato, and now we're seeing a revival of all that tendency, precisely because of the results of right-wing populism, that is quote unquote dumb people voting, and the result of these quote unquote dumb votes being people like Trump, etc. We do have this technocratic strand, and which was up to some extent also behind some called the so-called third way. Sorry. The third way of, you know, 1990s Clintonites and Blairites in distinction between center left and center right traditional parties, which, as you know, in many constituencies, and namely, for instance, in France, had as a result that abandoned by the traditional parties that used to represent the workers' causes, the social causes, the critique of capitalism causes, like the former Communist Party in France, etc., 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 went straight from the far left to the far right, because this anti-systemic appeal, etc., was felt to the right and not to the left. And this is a problem in itself, because when there's a lack of a clear choice, people tend to go towards what they perceive as being those who call out corruption, etc., etc., etc. And we're seeing it in Portugal right now too. And then finally, and very importantly, and this is the factor I am going to concentrate on, one of the other causes behind populism and right-wing populism is, of course, economic unrest and insufficient social protection. Okay, because when people do not live well off, of course, that discontentment tends to rise, and this is a threat to democracy in itself. And so my next slide is the very famous, it's the very famous quote by a former collaborator of Bill Clinton in his 1992 election, when there was a recession and Bush father, not W, George Bush, the first one, was ousted. And this was also a mention to Michael Dukakis's former failed campaign. It's the economy stupid, because the economy does play a large role in people's motivations to vote. And so populism does thrive on discontentment, and a key factor, among others, is tied to both economic success and social protection. And this is a very well-known, I'm giving no novelties here, but this is a very well-known narrative. But the fact that Trump in 2016, unlike in 2020, but that's another discussion, the fact that in 2016 Trump won the Rust Belt could be explained to our largest extent with the discontents of globalization. As you know, globalization had as a side effect a growing inequality in many Western countries, and many blue-collar workers feeling unprotected, etc. I would recommend Arlie. This is a classic, probably you know it, but I would recommend Arlie Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, 2016 book, in which he makes an in-depth study, an ethnographic study almost, with Tea Party supporters, and captures the, I would say, the cultural and political melting pot, if you would, that made possible a Trump victory in 2000, a Trump win in 2016. Okay. Now, the last decade saw two major crises: the subprime crisis and the subprime crisis 2007-2008, later transferred to Europe in the form of the sovereign debt crisis. That, you know, here in Portugal, as you recall very well, led us being, you know, bailed out by the institutions, the so-called track, etc. And now the COVID-19 pandemic. And so this leads the way, depending on the response by governments and states, and in our case, pretty much depending on the European response, but also can pave the way for a growing discontentment, which is a further threat to liberal democracy. And to all of this, we must add something which is not entirely exactly the same factor as this first one, but which is deeply connected to it, and which is important to recall in this descriptive part of the presentation, which is the shifting dynamics of the labor market. Okay. And what has been happening in a nutshell? So this part of the presentation, I am calling it labor market and social ailments. So I realized when I looked at Carlo Jalali, I thought I should have put a more empirical part of the presentation in. I should have brought hard data for the political scientists, and I'm sorry I didn't do it. But this is widely stated and can be fact-checked, which is ever since the 1970s, there has been an increasing tendency to deregulate, or better still, to regulate in a liberalizing way the labor market. Okay, and this at the same time, it of course started with Thatcher and Reagan, and all the offspring of what came to be known of neoliberalism. But this has been clearly tied with the growing rise of income inequality. In the US, this is very, very, very clear. In Europe too, even though, well, it depends on the scale in which we're measuring this, because there is less income inequality in Europe than in the United States, especially if you're looking at the 0.1%, because there are less tax loopholes, etc., 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 in Europe than in the US. Also, wealth inequality has been on the rise, and a lot of this also is explained, as if you look at Piketty, etc., is also explained by the fact that the remuneration of capital has always been and still is way higher than the remuneration of labor. Okay, and so this explains the concentration of wealth at the top 1%, which also explains the success of the slogan invented, I think it was by David Graeber, for the Occupy protest movement, which was, "We are the 99%. I mean, I am the 99%. I am assuming you are too. Now, this has been, again, this is very well known, but this has been combined with the rise of a specific class in the making, as Guy Standing calls it, which is precarious workers, the precariat. Okay, and so I mean, it's part of the Washington consensus, if you will, but there's an increasing, if you look at any IMF intervention in any part of the world, there is this one-size-fits-all approach to solving, you know, the ailments of different economies. And one of the elements of this one-size-fits-all recipe is always labor market flexibility. Okay, which basically translates to transferring risks and insecurity to workers. And there's a perverse, I talked about this in the abstract that Irena read. I'm not going too deep into this, but I mentioned the new spirit of capitalism. The new spirit of capitalism is a perverse way to naturalize and even to, how should I put it, to make people act as the employers or whatever, the big players in the capital scene, etc., want them to behave, and doing it willingly out of a joyous ideology. That is, just to explain, this is a side note, but I'll explain this in 1 minute. As you know, there are two major traditions in explaining capitalism. One is the purely economic, material side of it, if you will, in the Marxist tradition, in which, you know, culture, or the let's say the symbolic domain is pertains to the superstructure, and so is not entirely relevant in our way of perceiving and explaining the apparition and the evolution of capitalism. Okay, and then you have the Weberian way, which can be mixed and conjugated with the Marxian. I mean, they are not entirely incompatible unless you're an orthodox Marxist, okay, and you believe in material dialectics, etc. Well, I'm not going to go too much into this, but according to the Weberian tradition and the methodology of elective affinities, etc., you can very well explain economic phenomena such as capitalism due to the cultural, political, or religious beliefs of people. And so if you find a way to manipulate those beliefs, probably you can find a way to manipulate the behavior of people too, and make them act as you want them to act, even joyously. And this is a side note within the side note, but note the parallelism with social networks. I mean, Facebook or whatever other similar social network is this is being recorded, so I shouldn't say wet dream, but it is the wild dream of any political police. I mean, Stasi wouldn't have dreamt with Facebook, because you give willingly everything to Facebook instead of needing to have it get searched for any sort of political persecution. Okay, and so if you will, the new spirit of capitalism is an ideology justifying and naturalizing capitalism and making people believe that they can find self-fulfillment through work, and among other things, because then Boltanski and Chiapello, who write about the new spirit of capitalism in 1999, talk about the several stages in the spirit of capitalism according to the ways in which this ideology mutates. But one of the striking features of what they call, yes, the new spirit of capitalism from the 1980s onward, and the penetration of the discourse, the management discourse and the gurus and etc., is that you should embrace flexibility. Okay, a little bit like Catherine Malabou speaks about plasticity, etc. You should embrace flexibility, because a worker nowadays, a collaborator or whatever nowadays, should be flexible, should dominate soft skills, etc., and so this is kind of a way to, as we say in Portuguese, and I'm lacking the English equivalent to this expression right now, dourar a pílula, silver lining, okay, to the crude reality of just as standing, just to come back to my main argument, as standing argues, transferring risks and insecurity to workers. And so every time you read flexibility, you should hear precarity. Okay, and so in a nutshell, and as Guy Standing shows, precarious workers lack labor market security, employment security, job security, and work security. These are all slightly different notions, okay, because some of these have to do with the facility that you have or don't have to find a job. Another one has to do with the protection of the job you find. Another one has to do with protection, social protection in the job, like protection against accidents and stuff like that. And another one also has to do with the fact that you have or don't have a labor identity. That is, that you identify, that you self-identify with something that you do, which, I mean, all of those were present in traditional workers' rights, labor rights, okay? But if you have to have 2 or 3 jobs at the same time, if you're only employed discontinuously through time, if you work shifts, if you're sent away because your contract is not renewed at the end of the year and then you're re-employed 2 months after in September or whatever, if you are forced to do plenty of, as David Graeber calls it, shitty jobs, etc., throughout your life, and you don't work out of vocation, you work out of necessity and in a lot of different things, you also don't have a job identity. And you also lack, which is the second point here, well, you lack income security because you don't have a stable income. When you work, you have income. When you don't work, you don't have income. And you even lack, in many cases, access to proper representation. Because if you don't have a job identity, etc., many times you don't have access to unions and stuff like that. And so you're left completely outside of the traditional representation granted to workers. But you can almost boil all of this down, not everything, but boil all of this down to what Guy Standing calls economic security, which is much more than job security or labor market security. You lack economic security because it has ups and downs and you never know what your income is, etc. Hence, the need to perhaps discuss a different social model, a different social protection model, one that is better able to get to everyone, including the most vulnerable, including those who are not on the official statistics and figures, etc., and provide also to them, to everyone, including them, economic security. Okay, and it is against this backdrop that I will speak about universal basic income. Okay, so against this, I would say, a rather pessimistic description of the state of affairs and of the evolution of these last few decades, we can wonder, I mean, we can ask, how has the welfare state coped with these problems? Well, as you know, the welfare state is a recent invention. In Europe, it was implemented in most places after the Second World War, okay? And you can interpret it in several ways. From a more orthodox Frankfurtian view, I'm talking about the Frankfurt School, some people even interpret it as a way for capitalism to buy off workers. That is, to prevent the hypothesis of a revolution by buying people fridges and giving them access to universal healthcare, etc., etc., etc. So you can also have a critical eye on the welfare state. That's not my case. I think the welfare state is pretty much needed, even though it is in crisis. It has been in crisis for some decades now. But so I think it is more complicated than this. And obviously the strategies in the figures change from country to country. Okay, it's very different in Europe than it is in the US. And even in Europe, it is very different if we're comparing, I don't know, a Southern European state or an Eastern state or a Northern state, etc., etc., etc. Not everyone can be Sweden. And so we have very different realities. But I think we can say in a nutshell that most of the attention has been focused in tackling absolute poverty. Okay, not in tackling inequality, but mostly in tackling absolute poverty, which is a very, very important goal in itself, of course. And also of doing this, well, it depends because, for instance, in Portugal, as you know, social security is divided into very different schemes, okay? one which depends on the contributions of people, and another which is just for social aid. But I would say that there's a mix between this need to tackle absolute poverty and incentivizing work through what are called activation schemes. That is, by forcing people either to go to work in order to deserve, let's say, to be eligible to receive aid, social aid, or to be undergoing some sort of professional formation, etc., which is also a way to lower the unemployment figures. Because if you're actively searching for a job and then you get formation, or as soon as you get the, I'm sorry for quoting David Graeber again, the shittiest job available, then you go out of the official figures. And let's also say one of the obvious things, which is the official figures don't represent everyone, because you actually have to be on the look for a job in order to be on the official figures. If you are not officially looking for a job, if you are not enrolled in the unemployment schemes, etc., then you don't officially count as unemployed. And so the inactive people are actually much more than what the unemployment figures, official figures, tell you. But that's another problem. And so the question we might ask is, has the welfare state been successful in tackling these problems? And I would argue that, I mean, for all the merits that our welfare states have, they have been, to some extent, largely unsuccessful in tackling some of these problems, namely precariousness, etc. And so just a very quick look again. As you know, unemployment is again on the rise, now for a conjunctural reason, the pandemic, okay? But it is likely, I'm not going to go into these details, but a lot of people talk today, and this is futurology, I mean, who the hell knows? But there's a lot of talk about the possibility of technological unemployment in the future because of the so-called fourth industrial revolution, and namely automation, digitization, which is what we are doing right now. And so it might very well be that many of the tasks that still need human labor today will in the future be given to robots or algorithms or machines or whatever. And it might very well be, I mean, we can tackle degrowth, etc. But even if we don't go into degrowth, even if we stick to a traditional, pretty much criticizable, but a traditional perspective of, you know, productivity and economic growth, etc. I'm not saying we should, and I see Andrea looking at me, I'm not saying we should, but even if we do, it is very well possible that we might have even more, I mean, higher levels of productivity, more economic growth, etc. While most of the jobs are just automatized. I don't know if this word exists, but you know what I mean. And we need less and less of human labor. And what are we going to do then? I mean, are we letting people going into absolute poverty? Are we keeping to the same means tested, conditional means of social aid, forcing people to work, even though this work is not, to use an old terminology, socially necessary, let's say. And so in a nutshell, I think we can say that means-tested social schemes have two problems. One is that they can be humiliating. You can look at the film, you can see the film I, Daniel Blake, to have a good description of this situation, because I mean, they involve a high level of inspection on the recipients' lives, because usually, I mean, in many countries, in order to be eligible for these aids, you have to be you really have to be poor. I mean, in Portugal, you can't have, I think, more than 20,000 euros in your bank account, and you cannot have income. Otherwise, you lose access to, our minimum income scheme, which is Rendimento Social de Inserção, which is currently at around 2,000 euros per month or something like that, which is a disgrace. And so many of these people, sorry, I heard that in the Açores, they are cutting that to half. another discussion. And so one of the problems, the big problems, is that these schemes oftentimes leave people in poverty traps or unemployment traps, because people are almost compelled to deny a job, finding an excuse, or just keeping a parallel activity in the informal economy in order not to lose access to the social aid they have. And they don't have the right incentives to go look for that job, because if they are, let's assume I am very poor and I'm on a welfare scheme like that, and that if I get again quoting Grabber, a shitty job with the minimum income, I would say I would get more 200 euros or 300 or 400 euros per month. But I would be forced to go work, take a bus, do this, do that, eat out of the home, etc. And at the end of the month, I would have a significantly more effort, because I would have to do my job every day. And the difference in my bank account at the end of the month would be, let's say, 50 euros. I mean, would that be a worthwhile incentive for me? Maybe not. But if I remain in the same situation as I am, I will be poor and unemployed for a long time, maybe even all my life. Okay, and so means testing is not enough, in my opinion, to tackle these problems. Okay, so very quickly, sorry. What's happening in the European Union within all this context? Sorry, I'm just trying to change, as I speak, I'm changing the video so they don't cover my, my PowerPoint. I'm probably having the same problem, I'm sorry for that. Well, in the European Union, there is growing skepticism and estrangement from institutions, okay? Why? Because there had been a deepening of the perceived democratic deficit during the last crisis. I mean, think of the Eurogroup, the very shadowy nature of a non-elected body like the Eurogroup, and the preponderance it had in, you know, basically denying the claims of the legitimate representatives of the Greek people in 2015 when Syriza rose to power. Think about how they were squashed by the Eurogroup. Think about Brexit, etc., etc., etc. And in what comes down to welfare states and social problems, etc., what we can say is that there is a significant heterogeneity between welfare states, with different rights being upheld or not, very different standards of living, of course, and also acute inequality among regions. This is not very much talked about, and everyone says that there is much more inequality in the US than in Europe, and to which you must respond that it depends. Because if you take a place-based approach, that is, if you look at territories, in territories within the European Union, you'll find that among the poorest regions of Europe and the richest regions of Europe, there is more inequality than among the poorest states of the US and the richest states of the US. And so this is tricky. This is tricky, and it can be a problem. And also, of course, there has been a lack of capacity of European institutions to convey the advantages of belonging to the EU, you know, Brussels bureaucrats and all that stuff. And I would argue that the pandemic crisis and the social crisis that will follow can worsen this. I mean, it all depends on the European response. We have a big economic package, but it depends on a lot of factors. But this can get worse. And so, I don't have a lot of time now, but I'm starting to speak about UBI now. And Irena will tell me that I only have 10 minutes, but we'll see.
It's 15.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. To my defense, I will say that Maria João told me 45 minutes, maximum 1 hour, but but we're good. We're good. Okay. So the question is, can a European universal basic income be a partial solution to this set of problems? And note that I'm qualifying UBI twice. I'm talking about the European UBI, and I'm talking about the partial solution, okay? So why a European UBI? Because I argue that that's the scale we should be arguing, okay? I mean, I'm all for the Portuguese welfare state, etc., but I believe we can go further in the direction of strengthening of the welfare state. And I argue that both for political and for economic/financial reasons, some things such as a UBI would make much more sense and perhaps only be at least economically feasible at a EU level. Okay, and so this is the level at which I decide to be arguing. I mean, of course, that many people, when talking about UBI, they argue for the introduction at the national domestic level. Okay, we can go into that in the discussion if you want to, but this is my view on the subject. Okay, and so just to recap, for those of you who maybe are not that well acquainted with universal basic income, I'll just very briefly explain what it is before I go into the reasons why it might be desirable to adopt a universal basic income and whether or not it is both politically and economically feasible, okay? Which are different questions, I mean, as you all know. Okay, so basically, it's very simple. Universal basic income is an unconditional cash transfer. Okay, you can call it helicopter money, even though helicopter money is only one of the, let's say, the specific forms it can assume. Okay, and so it's basically giving money to everyone in a way that is universal, that is granted to everyone, that is periodic, which is to say paid at regular intervals rather than just a one-off payment. So it could be monthly. Usually people would argue that this is paid every month, but it could be every week or every year or whatever. It would be individual, that is not granted to households, okay, not granted to collective units of any sort. And there are reasons to defend this, namely the fact that there are more chances of domination within the household when someone controls the whole income for in the name of everyone, and think of a tyrant father or whatever, and you know, the small children who are not legally entitled to have access to the money, for instance. And then it is also unconditional, that is, as I have been arguing, not means tested or requiring activation, and also arguably being cumulative with other types of income, but that is, you can work and receive basic income and still retain those two incomes in full. That is, if you work and if you receive 1,000 euros salary and then you get the basic income, which is 500 euros, theoretically, you could have both in full. Then it all depends on the type of taxation you want to implement, and namely, if at some point you don't want it to be totally universal in its outcome, that is, yes, you do give it to everyone universally, but then you decide to, for instance, claw it back at some point if you are giving it to a rich person, for instance, who arguably doesn't need it. But this is a detail. We can discuss it afterwards if you want to, but theoretically, this would be cumulative with other types of income. And also very important, it would be sufficient to make a living. Some would even say make a dignified living, which is at least above the poverty line, which in Portugal in 2020 would be somewhere around 500 euros per month, okay? Then there's a complicated discussion surrounding this, which is, well, you know, in Europe, there's a rule that says that poverty is technically defined statistically, that is, it is 60% of the median income. But if you introduce a basic income, then you're automatically changing the median income, and so you're automatically changing the poverty line. And so you could be giving money to everyone, and still, statistically, by definition, the same people who were poor would remain already poor. But this is a false discussion. And then there's the macroeconomic problem of inflation and all that stuff. but this is a merely theoretical discussion, because you would be eo ipso eliminating absolute poverty, at least if there would be no macroeconomic shock that would make the currency really devalue because of the introduction of basic income. But this is, again, another discussion. Okay, so also quickly, why would UBI eventually be desirable? I'm not going to develop this very much. I'm just going to provide a few reasons, and then if you don't agree, we'll discuss it. Okay, I mean, theoretically, it would, as it were, virtually eliminate absolute poverty, okay? Because it would give people the money to make their own choices and to be materially viable in our society. Also, it would provide economic security for all, in the sense discussed above with Guy Standing. And it would uncouple the right to social protection from the moral necessity to work. Because what we have today with means-tested social aid is basically the non-assumed claim according to which you can only live, you are only morally entitled to live if you deserve it. And you only deserve it if you do something dignified with your life. And that something dignified is automatically assumed to be to work in a productive activity, paid labor. Okay. Now, I would argue that this is strange for a Catholic country, traditionally Catholic country, such as ours, and that from the standpoint of cultural history, this is actually a Protestant conception that would be totally foreign, you know, to late antiquity. I'm sorry, to ancient philosophy, etc., to antiquity, to the even to the Catholic tradition, as I mentioned. But that eventually became, you know, culturally dominant due to the Protestant Revolution, etc., due to Protestantism. Specifically, I would argue, yes, from the 17th century onwards, but with the great emphasis as soon as capitalism really kicked off, etc. But that's what we have, okay? And that's all the talk we hear about gypsies and all that stuff. I mean, the stigma associated with minimum income schemes, such as rendimento social de inserção, that allegedly, not really, but allegedly go to these minorities who don't want to do nothing, who are lazy, etc., 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 is rooted in this conception according to which, sorry guys, if you don't want to work and you're lazy, I mean, you're not really, that's not really a morally viable standpoint. Now, I'm, just to be clear, I oppose this view, and I think that giving a universal basic income would then uncouple the right to social protection from the necessity to work, thus going beyond this Protestant kind of thing. Now, it can also be argued that it would be emancipatory, because it would provide what Philippe Van Parijs called real freedom for all, thus providing a more solid basis for equality of opportunity. I'm not going to go into the, I'm not going to go into the very philosophic discussion between the different notions of equality, formal versus real equality of opportunity, etc., etc., etc. But this can be explained very easily by saying that equality of opportunity is an ideal, but if you don't provide people with the material means to actually exercise their freedom in order to have real access to an equality of opportunity, then it is a sham. And just, you know, just defending meritocracy as if real social inequalities were not an impediment to real equity, etc., it doesn't do at all, okay? And so real freedom for all, I mean, it has other details, but basically entails providing the material means for one to exercise his or her own freedom, and thus also tackling social exclusion and protecting the most vulnerable, such as I said, precarious workers. Then, also, why would the UBI be desirable? Well, it's probably more adapted to the way the job market works today and will likely work in the future. That is, if you ask me, I am also a precarious worker, such as many of you are, or I know I don't want to jinx you, but probably will be for some point of your lives in the future, okay? And I would be all for the return of the solid career paradigm of the past. Okay, if you give me a job for life, I would take it. Okay, if it's a good job. But that's not where we are right now, and there is no clear sign that this is a point to which we can return. And so I'm not saying that we should abandon that ideal, but I am also saying that for the current situation that we have right now, in a strained job market in which there is a scarcity of jobs available, and again, with the likelihood of automation, etc., you can have most of economic activities without recourse to human labor in the future. Something like a universal basic income would, and this is a point that Philippe Van Parijs also stresses a lot, would facilitate the transition between work periods and formation periods. So let's say you're working, but you're working in something you don't really like, and eventually you would like to change careers, but you don't have rich parents, you don't have a lot of money in your bank account, and you cannot afford losing the job that you have in a very strained job market. And so you never change your career, and you go on all of your life doing this job you don't really like, but out of fear of losing it, you keep doing it if you're lucky enough to have it. I mean, that's what I mean. With the universal basic income providing a safety net for everyone, you can very well decide that for some period of your life, for 2 to 3 years, eventually you live a more frugal life because you don't have an income from your job, but you decide to take up these years to study, to change your formation, and eventually to better prepare yourself to change your career. And everyone can do that, not only the children of rich families. Okay. And so it would also allow workers more bargaining power, so to refuse those same cheap jobs I have been talking about throughout this presentation. And so theoretically, allow for work to happen solely out of vocation. That is, you do what you would like to do. And if there's no such job for you, then maybe you just, like Philippe Van Parijs surfers, you just go on about living a frugal life and doing your own thing with little money, but just surfing all the time or whatever, because you have money at least to eat and to live your life more or less according to what you want. And you, I mean, there's no moral constraining reason for forcing everyone to have a job. And so ultimately, it could also free up time, okay, not only for leisure, because people might also just decide to have only a part-time job, leaving half of their day free to take care of their children, for instance, or for non-monetized or non-commodified activities. For instance, creative work that is not done out of, that has either the people who do it don't want to sell it. For instance, think of yourself as being a painter who doesn't want to sell their paintings. If you have no other source of income, and if you have a little talent, maybe you'll sell your paintings. But let's assume that all you're after is the creative activity in itself. With a basic income, you can dedicate most of your time to doing that, and then you still have enough to live a decent living. So free up time for creative work, social or political causes, and this is a connection with democracy. And eventually, as well, André Barata, but also our friend George Pinto, for instance, is constantly arguing, eventually, if it is enough really to live, it could allow for more frugal ways of living, because if there would be more people, I mean, the overwhelming majority of people would continue to work, okay? That's, I don't have a doubt, I don't doubt it. But if more people would decide to get out of the rat race, to quit their productive activities, that would also have an impact on resources in a world which doesn't have too many right now. And so it could be a boost towards more frugal ways of living, okay? And so to protect climate, etc., etc. So maybe eventually degrowth. And that's far-fetched, but it's defensible, that position is defensible. Now, just coming to my last, sorry, Irena, coming to my last PowerPoints, different question. Would the UBI be feasible? That's probably $1 billion question. but I'm dividing this into political feasibility and economic or financial feasibility, okay? And so here I have been arguing that a choice of a UBI as a different social model for the social welfare state is a political choice, in itself, and one that would favor democracy, I believe, because it would send a strong message to European Union citizens that social well-being is a European priority, thus making it perfectly clear, I believe, one of the advantages of belonging to the EU project. That's right, capitalism bought the workers and they didn't do a revolution. Now we're buying European citizens, giving them money. Or, as Van Parijs once argued, it's the capitalist way to communism. Maybe, just maybe. Now, this seems like a long way from our current divided predicament with, the rise of nationalisms, etc., etc., etc. But I argue it perhaps could be a new banner, eventually united, a progressive pro-European political option. And let's recall, I'm talking about UBI in the European context, okay? Now the billion-dollar question, which is financial feasibility. So would it be feasible right now? And this is one of the main worries of UBI skeptics. And I have to say, under the current treaties, no, for two reasons, okay? One, because under the current treaties, social protection is a competence of member states and not of the EU. And that's the end of it, okay? Two, we are all, and Portugal as a highly indebted sovereign state, under a strong conditionality of our budgets under the fiscal compact, okay? The Tratado Orçamental. And so, yeah, I mean, if you have how much is it right now? And 120 something our sovereign debt, and if we're supposed to get it but to 60% by 2030, which is an MTO, a medium-term objective, no way that's going to happen. I mean, something like a UBI, which, I mean, this math is not accurate, but which, if it wouldn't involve discounting the value of UBI in existing social aid, would involve something like a third of our GDP. But again, the math is not correct because there's a way to deduce it from pensions, etc., etc., etc. There are a lot of models. Of course, that with the fiscal compact, we cannot do it. But I would still argue that, one, it is easier to implement it at the supranational level, at the EU level, rather than at the domestic level. And it could be done, for instance, with a euro dividend, which is the proposal by Philippe Van Parijs and Yannick van der Port, financing with VAT, with IVA, the Portuguese. The Portuguese translation of VAT, value-added tax, is Imposto sobre o Valor Acrescentado. I can explain this in more detail in the discussion if you want to. And also several financing sources can be considered, including tackling offshores, taxing back income, taxing companies that go digital, taxing companies that replace jobs. There's a ton of ways to do this, and I would even argue the IRS, that is taxes on income generated through labor, is not the best way to do it, because it can generate resentment of those who are being taxed and are financing everyone else. And so I'm not in favor of doing it through the IRS. And I think Van Parijs is right that VAT is the only big enough tax to do it, even though it is an unfair tax because it's not proportional. This has a lot of implications. And so really my conclusion, there are a lot of things we can say about UBI. I haven't mentioned pilot projects, for instance, of which there are a lot going on right now. We can go into that too. And there are also many possible objections. I haven't spoken about those. There's the objection of reciprocity, which basically says that it's not fair that someone receives something from society without giving back something to that same society. There's objection that work is a key factor of socialization, of primary socialization, and a source of dignity, as I said. There are economic feasibility worries, etc. We can go into that into discussion too, because I believe probably there are skeptics of UBI in the audience. And finally, just pardon the promotion, but I've been speaking about this at European level. And I don't know if you are PhD students in political science, so you probably know this better than me. I'm just a political philosopher, and so, just blah, blah, blah. But probably, probably you've heard about European citizens' initiatives. They are an important mechanism of direct democracy predicted in the Lisbon Treaty. They are very flawed because they are very demanding. In order to have a European citizens initiative approved, and if approved, the only thing that happens is that you're inviting the European institutions to legislate on a given cause. Okay, you need to have at least 1 million people with at least 7 different member states reaching significant thresholds that are calculated. It has to do with the number of members that country has in the European Parliament, multiplied by the total number of MPs in the European Parliament. So, for instance, for an initiative to be successful in Portugal, you have to have at least 14,000 signatures. But then if you get enough signatures, you'll get to present your proposal to the European Commission, and then the European Commission can decide what to do with it. Maybe they do nothing, maybe they do something, but it has to be discussed by the European Parliament, the European Commission, etc. And currently there is a European Citizens Initiative in order to implement basic incomes at the European level. Okay, and so it is underway. It has been going for a month now. I think they're like at 66,000 signatures right now. They need to reach 1 million by next year, by 26 September next year. And so if you agree with this vision, please feel free to sign it. You have the links there. I can send them through the chat too, and to talk with your friends about it or not. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for your patience, and yeah, I did speak a little too much, sorry.
You're just on time.
I'm ready to field your questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, and you're right on time, and also your presentation was very good, and it was appealing, even though it was not maybe graphical, as you mentioned, appealing. It was more appealing in other way of contactual way. So we will have now 45 or 40 minutes for discussion, additional discussion. So if any of you would like to start with a question, you can raise a hand or just wave, or okay. So we have Angela, yeah. So you can unmute. No, okay. He's having some issues.
Sorry, just a moment. No, that's not the problem. I was going to ask if I can ask my question in a written form. My English is not very good lately. Can I?
Yeah, sure. Put it on the chat. Yeah.
No problem. Okay.
Sure. Or I mean, if I don't know if there are a lot of people who don't understand Portuguese, but if you want to,
it's in English. So I'll put the question I'm going to put in the written form will be in English, because I prefer my English written, not spoken.
Go ahead.
The only problem. Just a moment.
Yeah, just whatever. However makes you feel more comfortable. But if anyone does have the pressing need to ask a question in Portuguese, then just ask it in Portuguese. We'll translate it into English, and I can answer in English. Okay.
So maybe while he's writing the question, typing the question, is there someone else who would like to jump in?
Yeah, it's already there, but
already
go ahead, Dave.
Then we can start with this written, and then we will go to the oral.
Okay, so I'll read it out loud for everyone. Maybe it's easier, and then yeah. Okay, since at least Aristotle, Western civilization has cherished the ideal of eudaimonia, a life of contemplation in the philosophical sense. Technological development has been understood historically as one of the main means to achieve that ideal. But as Marcuse has put it already in the beginning of the 20th century, technological development has been political bias towards production, striving for its maximization. My question here is, does the implementation of UBI on a global scale represent a good strategy to undermine this political bias of technology, of its rational drive towards production? And if so, does this have an impact in the way we do science nowadays? Having in mind, for instance, the race for COVID-19 vaccine and all of its implications. Yeah, it's a big question. Thank you. I like Marcuse. I try to be, in my own limited way, a critical theorist too. So I totally agree with the first type of assessment. That is, yeah, I mean, we do find in antiquity, and namely in Aristotle, namely in the Protrepticus, this apology that is of leisure, of otium, of ócio, how we say in Portuguese, okay? And we do find this notion that, well, work is for slaves, right? And so the most dignified ergon, the most dignified acts for human being are either contemplation or what Aristotle called the mixed form of life, which was politics, because no one was, in the Aristotelian sense, able to just spend his or her whole life contemplating, even though it is the most dignified way of living because it's the most autonomous, etc., etc., etc. And we do find echoes of this vision throughout our history. But it is true that mainly about that since modernity, okay? Since modernity, but increasingly with capitalism, etc., we find this deep association between knowledge and the domination of nature, if you want, and this drive towards production, etc., etc., etc. I mean, André writes about this better than I speak about it, so you can go and read André Barata's book. Just trying to tackle the questions. The first question boils down to, what's the influence of UBI in productivity? I would answer two different things, which is, I think that it would unburden everyone's shoulders of the need to be productive in order to have a life, okay, in order to live. While I am not sure that at the societal level, at the economic level, it would necessarily make us as a society less productive, because you have to take the human factor out of the equation and say that eventually, as I said, with technology, etc., 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 you can have the same or even higher levels of productivity without actually forcing everyone to work. Okay, so that's the first thing I would say. And then concerning technology, well, coming back to Greece again, if you want, I look at technology, this is perhaps a very traditional way of putting, but I look at technology as a pharmacon, which is, it depends on the way you use it, right? And so you can use technology for domination, or you can use technology for emancipation. When some people talk about fully automated luxury communism, it means this old utopia, this old dream that you can trace back at least to the utopian socialists or whatever, of, yeah, humans being more liberated because machines do much of the heavy work. And this is, yeah, actually a dream at the level of humankind. But then if you attribute moral agency to robots, and if you consider them selves, such as we are, then we are enslaving them. And then it becomes problematic too. But this is a side question. And then your last question, if so, does this have an impact in the way we do science nowadays, having in mind the race for the COVID-19 vaccine and all of its implications? I am not exactly sure if I grasp what you're getting at here, but I'll say this, and then if you want, you can clarify.
Yeah.
I'll say this. It has to do with what I said when responding earlier, which is, not everyone will be driven towards productivity, but you know, competitiveness within capitalism and productivity within our economic system will still happen. And so I wouldn't say that this would necessarily create a society in which, you know, less people working and more laziness going around, etc., would make for less optimal scientific results, because you would take the competition out of the equation. I wouldn't see this happening. I would, however, see the possibility perhaps to revitalize other knowledge forms that are currently not very much favored in our current you know, academic capitalism landscape, such as, for instance, the humanities. Because if we are all more or less autonomous to pursue what we want to do because we have the material means to survive, etc., and if we're not that dependent on state financing favoring, you know, the creation of profit or applied science or whatever, or depending on having our application for FCT to be financed even though they only have money for 3 applications out of 62, maybe something different could ensue. I don't know. This was kind of a weird answer, but maybe that was not what you were aiming at, and if so, I'm sorry.
No clarification needed. I was just trying to grasp if you have contemplated the link between the political system and the economical system and the way technology progresses and develops. That was the point, more or less, of my question. But your explanation was fantastic. Congratulations for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you
I could
much.
get into that complex question, but maybe let's open up the floor and then we can come back if need be. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
We had a question from Ivo, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, if I can. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm personally very much in the principle in favor of UBI, but I have serious doubts about how it can be applied in practice. So I have some considerations, if I can. The first of them is why you consider it UBI and you do not consider it like a model like the Danish Flexi security. Maybe the Flexi security is a step between the model that we have now and the model of UBI, and maybe it's very much fair on the kind of point of the society that we have in now. The other question is, how do you relate the application of UBI in Europe, for instance, with the migration fluxes that we are facing and that you have been facing in previous years, when you have borders and you have neighbors in a neighbor region that really needs to overcome their basic situation, and they can be very much seduced of a society regime with a basic income for all. The other relation that I would like to address, it was the relation with UBI and the employment rate, considering that if the level of the minimum wage is very close to the UBI, what could be the relation with employment rate and the how can I say, the need of the people that are in employment to find a job? How do you balance these two approaches? You also make a statement about the reasons why it makes sense to implement UBI. You spoke about the work security, the need of representation, what is not absolutely accurate, considering that, like for an example, in the Portuguese political spectrum, left bloc is very much engaged with this kind of representation of precariousness. But anyway, and economic insecurity. Of course, that I would add to these topics the free will and the idea that you tackle in the end of the dandization of the society. The idea that well, I can be an artist, and even though that no one is interested in my art, I will be paid for that, and I will be very much okay with that. I think that this is moral balance of dandization and the idea of a productive society, and a society that aim to overcome moment after moment. It's very interesting. I had some other questions, but I will be more straight to the point. The other idea is the debate between the GDP and the GNH society. Do you see that there is any real link between UBI and the society that is driven by the product, or the society that is driven by the happiness? There is any relation that you can see from that? And then there is a lot of, the last question is very provocative. When you stand for the idea of UBI, are you looking for eliminate the poor, but maybe not to eliminate the poverty, in the idea that the poverty is not only about the financial condition, is also about social, educational, community, and so on condition? I have some more comments, but
maybe we can stop here with these questions, and then if we have more time at the end, we can continue with others. And I think the Professor Barata will also wanted to add something, or no?
Yes, I would like also to say something. Well, first, I would like to start to congratulate Gonçalo, whose presentation was so brilliant in English, as usually he is in Portuguese language. So congratulations, Gonçalo. Well, I just have three remarks. Well, a provocative remark. One of them is something that I've been thinking on lately, which is the possible connection we can make between the climate crisis and the need of a UBI. What I mean is that most of the discussion of climate crisis is related with the idea that we are in a kind of train, an uncontrolled train in a high speed travel to a kind of cliff. So to a catastrophe situation. But what is the diesel of that train? Is that conception of work as the only way to survive? Work as the only tool through which people in general, of course, in our contemporary societies can provide their own subsistence. So I believe one strong argument for UBI can be an answer or part of an answer to climate crisis. I would like to hear you about this. Another remark is related with European Union. You talked about European Union, and I truly believe that UBI could be a kind of rebuilding of the social pillar of European Union. Of course, it would be necessary to think quite well what kind of UBI we could provide to all European citizens, because there are very different social standards in European Union. Even so, I believe it would be a very challenging but possible way to recover the hope to the European Union project. It's a second remark. A third remark is about the problem of the funding, the feasibility of UBI. And there, I believe that there are two aspects I would like to emphasize. One of them is this idea that, well, if we have an economy that is evolving in a direction of becoming independent of work, if you have an economy not based on work, on labor, not based on labor, growing, I believe that economy must contribute socially. So the social contribution we require from work, we should also require from all the sectors of economy not based on work. I mean, financial economy, but also automated economy in industry. I believe robots should pay taxes somehow. Social taxes, of course, not our IRS, but our social contribution, equivalent to that. And there is another remark, and it's the last one, related with the feasibility also, because there is a strong argumentation against UBI because it's not possible. So if it is not possible, we should forget the idea. But there is a point. Once I tried to develop this with Renato Carmo, a sociologist, but and the point is this one. I believe if a country as a society with less inequalities, it would be easier to implement a UBI policy. And if you have a country with huge inequalities, is extremely difficult to implement a UBI policy, because somehow you will need you will need a huge amount of money, but if the society is relatively equal, the effort you ask from people will be given back to them somehow. But if you have a pyramidal structure, of course, you need to require a lot to the richest sectors of society, and after a certain level of taxes, it will be something violent, if I may say so. So that will be a problem. So I believe we could work with UBI, not as a unique policy, but a policy in a basket of several policies working in that direction of in decreasing inequalities. And if you have a reasonable equality level, for instance, Gini level, the Gini index in a level equivalent, I would say, with Norway or Sweden, that could make feasible a UBI policy. Well, that's all. And thank you very much, and congratulations. It's a pleasure always to hear you.
Thank you, Andre. My pleasure to be here. Here being Zoom or whatever. Irena, should I have a go? Or?
I hope that you will manage with all these remarks. Maybe in the following time it will be easier to go one by one. But yeah, I saw that you put it on the paper, so
yeah, I was writing.
Yeah.
Okay, not the answers, just the questions. Okay, so 2 interventions, and if I'm counting well, 10 remarks, 10 questions / comments. Okay, so thank you both for your very challenging remarks. I have an habit of not dodging questions. I hope I'm not, I'm not exactly sure if I will be able to answer them all in a satisfactory way, but yeah, let me have a go. Okay, so the first question by Ivo was on the Danish model of Flexi security. Okay, so a couple of things. I'm by no means an expert in this model, in the Danish welfare state, etc. Yeah, but here's what I can tell you. there's a meaningful alternative to universal basic income, if you will, which is a state, much like the Nordic model of welfare states, which has universal services for everyone that actually do work with a high level of taxes. Okay, and so when we really have free quality education, free quality healthcare, and a lot of other services financed by the welfare state and by huge taxes, and you have to choose between them and universal basic income, I would say that's theoretically a choice between two good solutions, except that they are promoting different types of realities, because ultimately with UBI it's not paternalistic, and so you do whatever you want with your money. Okay, whereas in many other places what you have is strong conditionalities even in the aid that is given. Think about food stamps, for instance, in many places like the US, etc. So I would not say that this model is bad in itself. I mean, the Nordic model of the welfare state, but I would argue that UBI is more radical. It's a different model and perhaps more adjusted to the reality of the job market that I described in the presentation, first. Second, I would say that there are some aspects to this flexibility model that can be arranged and combined with UBI. For instance, the flexibility in the working time hours and the reduction of working schedules. Okay, sometimes people argue that we have to choose between them, that is whether to have a UBI or whether just to work less. I would argue that if you need less human labor because of automation, etc., there's no reason why you shouldn't work less, but at the same time also have a universal social security net such as universal basic income, with the difference being that if you don't forcibly lower by decree the number of hours people can work, you still leave some people the choice to work more if they want to, because they're workaholics or whatever. And so if we don't want to force everyone to work, we don't necessarily want to stop people from working more than others, etc. Third, I see one bad thing in the apology of flexibility, which is precisely what I described as just the naturalization of the precariat. And so if you look closely at what's happening in some of these countries that are putting more stress in the need to, take the teeth of the unions and just liberalizing the job market and curtailing on social rights, on workers' rights, etc., is that they're hiding a reality in which there is less workers' rights. And I'm not exactly sure that that should be preferable. And so without chastising this model, I would still think that theoretically a model of universal basic income would be preferable. Second, migration. I'll try to go faster. Migration. Yes, it's a big problem because when we're talking about excluded people, we're also talking about migrants. And so I could have given an entirely different lecture on the topic of migration, which also preoccupies me insofar as we have citizens and we have denizens. And usually a UBI would go for members of a close political community, a polis, and there's a danger of leaving the most fragile people and those who really don't have no political representation whatsoever because they are not citizens, namely migrants. And so this has to be handled with care. I am not for an open borders policy tout court, but I am for treating both refugees and economic migrants fairly. And so this is one of the reasons why I argue for the introduction of this at the European level and not at the national level, because obviously if Spain has a UBI and Portugal has none, but if I can move freely to Spain and have a UBI, so maybe I just move to Spain. But if you do this at the European level, it still is different, and you can still choose at the European level who to let or not to let go in. And you can say, oh, but it would be hell, because then you would have the whole of Africa at the doors of Europe knocking because they would want a UBI. And I will say, not necessarily, because you already have, I mean, you wouldn't have a UBI that would be above our means, our possibilities as Europeans. And so what you would have would be a significant redistribution in order to be able to give a UBI to people. But already you have strong welfare states, weak welfare states within Europe, and already you have migrants coming in and not entering to Greece and not wanting to stay in Greece, just moving to Germany or Sweden, etc., precisely because of the existing welfare state, even without a universal basic income. So if anything, a universal basic income at the European level would probably unify more or less the social welfare models among European member states. And so the choice would be between coming into Europe or not coming into Europe, but less where you're based in Europe. And it's a difficult question, but I wouldn't say that people would come more to Europe because of the universal basic income, because they already come for education, for healthcare, for a decent living, etc., etc., etc. Okay, employment rates, minimum wage, etc. So it's the problem of the incentives to work. Okay, and here, okay, no one exactly knows what would happen because UBI has never been tried at a large scale at the level of an economy, but some pilot projects have been conducted, and the provisional results will show that people do not necessarily work less. Okay, so people still have the incentive to work. And one of the very important things is it's a basic income that is above subsistence level. And so to be very clear, even assuming that you would have a minimum wage and a basic income at very similar levels, you are still arguing that you can accumulate income from work with income from the universal basic income. And so it would be a very simple difference. People only with basic income would live with 500 euros a month. People with a basic income and a minimum wage would live with 1,100 euros per month, 1.100 euros. And that's a huge difference. One of the things you can say is that more people who are now forced to work for the minimum wage would refuse those shitty jobs. And that's exactly right. And that's one of the things we want. And so you would argue, oh, but we still need people to come and do those tasks. Well, two things. Either you pay better for the same grueling task, or you automate it. I know this might not work in every case, but that's my general conclusion. So I don't think that the minimum wage would be eliminated. It's a matter of putting it into law. Maybe the medium wage could be eliminated, but that's another discussion. Okay, representation. Yeah, you say, some people say that the left bloc is kind of a union for the precarious workers. Yeah, but that's not the type of representation I was talking about. I was talking about proper unions in the formal sense of the word, etc. And that being said, short of a basic income, and you know that the left is usually against basic income. I mean, not everyone. I get Andrea here and maybe myself included, we're kind of part of the progressive front of UBI. But many of the traditional left is against UBI because they are for workers' rights. The Communist Party is against UBI, the left bloc is against UBI. Livre is for UBI, more or less. PAN, well, let's not talk about PAN because it's too complicated. I would say this, short of a UBI, I'm comfortable that there's a political party that takes the cause of precarious workers. And so I'm happy with the work that the left bloc does in that matter. Okay, the Dandization of society. I was wondering what I had written on my on my sheet of paper. Yeah, why not? I mean, this goes back to what Andrea was saying about the drive for productivity, etc., etc., etc. Again, UBI is non-paternalist, and I guess you can have a good society. You can have a society that evolves, that grows economically, if that's what you want, that has moral progress or whatever. and still people are given the choice to work or not work. Again, most people would continue to work, but if there's a small amount of people who would decide not to work and who would decide to live more frugal lives only with those 500 per month, my question is, I mean, why not? I mean, what moral reason do we have to prevent that from happening? So GDP and the happiness index, etc. Well, I would say, I mean, this is a big discussion. There's no direct connection between the two things. That is, you can still have your degree of success as a society measured in terms of gross domestic product, even though this is, even the guy who invented GDP said it's not to be taken that seriously, but you can still have that. And have a pre-distributive or redistributive measures such as basic income. But I would say this, I would say that countries like Bhutan and whatever, that do think that development and happiness are priorities over and above GDP and economic growth. And you can discuss Amartya Sen or Martin Nussbaum or whatever. I would say that this line of reasoning is more or less in line with the prospects that UBI opens. I'll say one sentence about this. We were talking about eudaimonia earlier, etc., and you were talking about UBI as a non-paternalist social policy, etc. Insofar as one of the goals of UBI is to provide people with the material means to do whatever they want with their lives, I guess you can tie that to a degree of well-being that is important and that is also valued by these alternative ways to measure how successful, let's say, society is. And so, even though it's not the same thing, I would say that they share some of the goals, this happiness index and UBI. And then finally eliminate the poor, but not poverty. Well, I, for one, do not share that vision that you find among elites. I wouldn't say everywhere, but in many places. Some people say that this is a feeling among the rich in Brazil, for instance, that the problem is not poverty, the problem is the poor, insofar as the poor are undesirable presences, etc., etc., etc. I would agree that there is a lot more to human well-being or happiness or whatever than just material means. I mean, yeah, sure. And okay, you can argue that, you can say like Harari says, that because of automation and the fourth industrial revolution, there will be a class of useless people. That is, people who won't have jobs and they'll just spend the whole day playing video games or whatever. Well, for them, that already happens. And secondly, I mean, I'm not that of a perfectionist. That is, well, I believe in eudaimonia, and I believe that you have to choose the right kind of life for you and exercise it as much as you can. And so I have a kind of an Aristotelian view on that too. But I don't believe there's a unique way of life for everyone that should be imposed on everyone. And so if there's this class of people who choose not to do anything, you might argue that they are poor spiritually. And maybe the solution will be to keep having a good education, to keep providing people with opportunities, the cultural opportunities to, cultivate themselves if they want to be civilized, etc., etc., etc. But still, I mean, I would say that ultimately this has not much to do with UBI, because you give money to people, you let them live their lives, and then you provide opportunities socially for them to choose the lives they want. I mean, ultimately, you can tell me money doesn't buy happiness, and I will completely agree with you. But it does help a tiny little bit, at least under the capitalist conditions we live in. Okay, and it's easier. For instance, I'm not saying that this is what you're saying, but it's easy for someone who is affluent to downplay redistribution. He says, I mean, why should I give this guy more $100 or whatever? But this is the privilege that only those who are already, this is the privilege of an argument that only those who are already affluent can make. Because if you're living under the minimum wage or whatever, it does make a difference, okay? Even though it doesn't solve all of society's problems. So very quickly to Andre. Andre, I agree with all what that you said, and I think we can leave it at that. Some of the things you said, I mean, I briefly mentioned a few of them in my presentation. I basically agree with them. I mean, yes, UBI and climate change. I mean, UBI wouldn't solve the climate problem. I mean, that's for sure. But insofar as you could have more people living frugal ways of life, sorry, Eve is writing, I'll get to that in a minute. Insofar as people can live more frugal lives, consume less resources, not be forced to be as productive as they are right now, etc., etc. Yes, it could be a way to help us transition towards a model of or degrowth or whatever. That being said, I do agree with George Pint when he says that it all depends on the level of the basic income, because I also argue that because of the economic difficulty of gathering such a large amount to distribute for everyone, that you could have a partial implementation that is start at a lower level. For instance, Van Parijs talks about 200 euros for the euro dividend, then adjust it to the level of the standard of living of each European country, etc. And then you could move on for more significant basic incomes. That would have the advantage of the marginal utility, etc. Because for people who have very few, even 200 euros per month can make a significant difference, but no one can make a living out of 200 euros per month. And so one of the risks, as George argues, is that an income, an additional income which is not appropriately basic, that is, of which you cannot live solely from it, probably would be funneled to consumption rather than to a more frugal way of living. And so that could actually worsen the problem, the climate problems, etc., etc., etc. As for UBI rebuilding the social pillar of the EU and provide hope in the European project, yes. I think that's a nice way to phrase what I was trying to do here today, which is I was arguing that by implementing strong social policies such as universal basic income, the European Union could rekindle the hope in its project, and somehow, this doesn't sound very well, but somehow by the adhesion of its citizens, because they would clearly see the advantage of being in the European Union. Finally, as for the feasibility and the funding that Andre was talking about, yes, exactly. Envisioning a social contribution from all the sectors of the economy that are not based on work to gather a large amount of money that could then be redistributed, for instance, in the form of a basic income, under invoking the commons, really. Because if the earth pertains to everyone, then everyone should have a fair claim in, reveling on his shares, etc., etc., etc. I am totally for it, and I also totally agree that it has to be a part of a mix of policies, a basket of policies. UBI by itself would solve very little. It would solve some things, but it wouldn't solve anything. The thing that you said that I had never thought about was the relation between the capacity for a society to implement UBI versus inequality. Okay, I had never thought about it, but so you should first tackle inequality and then implement a basic income. Possibly. That being said, the more unequal the society you have, the more you need a basic income. And so this is, kind of a paradox. But making robots pay TSU, we should have said that to Passos Coelho in 2011, and maybe there wouldn't have been such a protest.
Gonçalo, for tackling all all the questions and all the issues one by one. So I would say that we have like 10 minutes more for 2 more questions or something like that. We already passed 2 hours, but yeah. If there is someone who didn't already ask a question, I will give the priority. If Angela does not, it's okay with that. If not, then I think you can go.
I'd like to put the question, but may I put my question in Portuguese?
Yes, sure.
Obrigada. Também estou no carro, está um pouco complicado. Espero que a rede não me abandone. Pronto, queria agradecer ao Gonçalo por esta intervenção. Eu queria lhe perguntar se conhece as teses de um economista italiano que se chama Andrea Fumagalli, que também está numa política com outro economista francês, que agora, infelizmente, não me lembro o nome. A questão é sobre se o rendimento básico tem que ser também universal ou não universal. Este economista italiano coloca a questão assim, ele fez algumas contas, disse, se nós queremos fazer agora, nestas condições que temos atualmente, o rendimento básico na Itália, incondicionado, não é? Não como o rendimento de cidadania que existe, incondicionado. Então temos 2 hipóteses, no fundo. A primeira é privatizar todos os serviços públicos, portanto, eliminar o welfare para implementar o rendimento básico universal, incondicionado. Mas pronto, ele diz, esta não é uma boa medida, porque imaginamos, nós temos o rendimento básico, depois temos que pagar a saúde, temos que pagar a nossa educação, não é? E, portanto, não resolve o problema. E esta era uma primeira chamada de atenção que gostava de fazer. Quando o Gonçalo disse que pôs quase, não é, rendimento básico como uma alternativa ao welfare, na medida em que o welfare é uma questão de paternalismo do Estado. E eu não colocava a questão neste termo, porque isto é muito perigoso, porque pode sair uma visão libertária do rendimento básico que até pode ser, de alguma forma, neoliberal, não é? Também não esquecemos que os grandes monstros da Silicon Valley também querem implementar o rendimento básico, portanto, temos que ter cuidado aqui. E por exemplo, esses economistas italianos juntam a análise sobre o rendimento básico com a análise sobre um novo welfare, que eles chamam de common fare. E, portanto, é muito interessante esta não out-out, não é? Mas uma complementaridade da conversa da questão do rendimento básico incondicionado e a questão do common fare, ou seja, repensar também o welfare state. E relativamente à questão da universalidade, não é? Se não queremos privatizar por completo todos os serviços do Estado, diz este economista, então, fazendo as contas, cada mês, cada italiano poderá ter 52 euros, não é, no bolso, o que é uma medida ridícula. Então, qual é a sua proposta? E neste ponto, eu discordo por completo com o outro economista francês, que agora não me lembro o nome. A sua proposta é manter a incondicionalidade, mas eliminar a universalidade. É, portanto, implementar o rendimento básico que seja só para aquelas partes da população que vive embaixo da média, não embaixo da pobreza, mas da pobreza relativa, portanto, embaixo de um certo rendimento. E desta maneira, ele, nas suas contas, não é, imagina que seria possível na Itália implementar o rendimento básico a cerca de 800 euros mensais, dizemos assim. E aqui também, como reabrir estes fundos? Aqui tem outra análise muito interessante, não sei se o Gonçalo conhece, que é uma análise do quantitative easy for the people, não sei se já ouviu falar disso, ou seja, a ideia é que como quantitative easy foi feito para dar liquididade aos bancos, uma parte deste dinheiro do Banco Central Europeu ser destinado para os rendimentos, não é? E esta medida também estava no programa do Corbyn na Inglaterra, portanto, gostava também de ouvir a sua opinião sobre esta questão. E, por fim, última questão, estes economistas também têm uma visão muito interessante do rendimento básico, na medida em que eles dizem que nós não temos que pensar o rendimento básico como medida de redistribuição da riqueza, mas temos que pensar o rendimento básico como medida de como medida de retribuição do trabalho. Então, ele insere a questão do rendimento básico na mais ampla questão da forma do trabalho contemporâneo. Eles dividem o capitalismo pós-fordista em duas faces. A face do capitalismo cognitivo, ou seja, o tal precariado que o Gonçalo falou muito, e eles dizem que nesta fase do capitalismo cognitivo o salário já não é a forma de medir o valor do trabalho, não é? Por quê? Porque os cérebros continuam a trabalhar também fora do horário de trabalho. Bom, dito isso muito sinteticamente. Mas eles até dizem que agora, com o novo capitalismo, que eles chamam de capitalismo das plataformas, nós não temos trabalho precário, temos o trabalho que é não retribuído. Ou seja, a nossa vida virtual é uma contínua produção de valor que se transforma em lucro para muitas empresas multinacionais, não é? As grandes empresas multinacionais. E, portanto, eles dizem que o capitalismo das plataformas é um capitalismo que mesmo radica-se no trabalho não retribuído. E, portanto, eles consideram que o rendimento básico tem que ser entendido não como medida redistributiva, mas como rendimento primário, ou seja, como se fosse um rendimento complementar, exatamente porque o trabalho salariado, a visão do trabalho no âmbito como trabalho individual é algo que está ultrapassado por quê? Porque o trabalho hoje em dia é uma questão imediatamente social, é uma socialidade que vive, não é? E isto claramente é aquela visão pelo que produção e consumo tendem quase a se identificar, porque o próprio consumo se torna um elemento produtivo e, portanto, eles consideram o rendimento básico como uma medida de retribuição do trabalho e não de redistribuição da riqueza. Portanto, gostava de ouvir a sua opinião sobre essas questões. Obrigada.
So, Gonçalo, will you?
I'm not sure if I should reply in English or in Portuguese. I was taking notes in Portuguese.
Yeah, I think you can actually continue however you prefer. I guess that all the people here are Portuguese except me. So at this moment, so.
Okay, but do you understand Portuguese? No.
I can understand. I understood the majority of Irena's comments.
Okay. No, okay, but Irene for sure understands English, and so yeah, I'll try to answer in English, very very quickly, because there are also a lot of comments, and I'm not sure I was able to pick them all in such an efficient fashion as I did the ones from Ivo and Andrea. sorry. Okay, so Andrea Fumagalli, the name does ring a bell, but I'm not really well acquainted with his works, and so I have to refrain from commenting specifically on his works, but I'll comment on what you said. Okay, so the first thing I would have to say is that there are a lot of models for universal basic income, as there are people defending or criticizing it from different sides of the political aisle. Okay, and so I would say this: I think I can speak for myself and for the overwhelming majority of people who support universal basic income, which is this. I'm not saying that the welfare state necessarily has to be paternalistic, okay? Sure. And I would be the first in line to try to fight this neoliberal vision, either supporting or attacking universal basic income. And so if the choice is, our friend Andre at some point wrote, the question is not UBI, yes or no, but which UBI? Because, you know, the devil is in the details. And so, yes, there are libertarian, Friedmanesque, or I don't know how to say, Hayek is whatever, supporters of universal basic income, precisely because they would want to replace everything that exists in terms of social security for a universal basic income with, as you well said, Irene, the unlikely consequence that then you would cease to fund public education, healthcare, etc., 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 and people would have the money in their pockets, but they would cease to be free to go to the hospital free of charge, etc. So some people would be free to have or don't have access to healthcare and education because they would do whatever they would want with their money. And if they don't want to go to the hospital and just spend all their money smoking 30 packets of cigarettes per day, that's fine. Yeah, if that's the question being discussed, then sign me out of a UBI proposal, because I would not prefer to have a UBI and not a welfare state as you know it. I would prefer the current situation. That's what I'm saying. But I am arguing something different, which is both me and 90. I don't have the exact figures because I don't think there's a questionnaire having ever having been done about this. But I would say that 90 to 95% of all UBI advocates have a progressive view on it, which is as a way to reinforce the social welfare state rather than completely replacing. Now, having said this, the question becomes a question about financing and resources and how much would it cost and what kind of options would you have to make in order to have a UBI that is economically feasible, okay? And as I said, I don't believe it would be feasible either in Italy or in Portugal or in Spain or in any other single European country as of now, mainly because of the treaties and mainly because of the taxation system that we have. I would say this for sure. A UBI would involve a massive, massive, massive redistribution of existing resources, those that are within the system and those that are not, for instance, the offshores, okay? And then you can ask me, how do you go and get that money? Well, that's a question for international financial regulation to solve. But Europe, as a supranational space that pretty much pushes or tries to push forward, at least in official discourse, fight against corruption, etc., 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 could have a very important role to play within this, towards this goal. Now, having said this, as I said, there are many models, okay? And so, for instance, out of financial restrictions, you can have, and you mentioned some of these possibilities in your question, in your comments, you can have models in which, for instance, you attribute to everyone, but then you cease to make it unconditional in the sense that you can determine that there's a threshold beyond which people still receive the UBI, but if you take into account the whole of their income, they get taxed back, not only in the amount of the basic income, but perhaps even more, because we need to get money from somewhere in order to finance the basic income. And so whatever you decide to call it, a UBI would be a massive redistribution of existing recourses, as I said. And then the way of framing it, okay, you talked about cognitive capitalism and of framing basic income not as redistribution, but as retribution for work, etc., etc. So I think that's exactly right. One of the things I tried to say, but I said it very quickly during my presentation, is that, well, there's a difference between work, different types of activity that you can consider as work, and paid labor. I mean, of course. And for instance, reproductive labor or creative labor that is not rewarded and acknowledged as such in the form of paid labor, or even the work of the minds that are at work within cognitive capitalism, but I mean, they never stop and they are, you know, providing data, etc., to the social networks. I would say that for all meaningful activity that people do and which does not get acknowledged and is not remunerated, basic income could be a way to value that activity, because with the basic income, you get the basic income just because you exist. It's kind of social protection as a human right, ultimately. And so ultimately, everything that you do because you exist is being somehow rewarded, because you are giving the possibility to continue keep doing just that, and you'll still survive. and you don't have to sell yourself as a commodity in the market. Okay. And so some people argue that this is actually a form of pre-distribution.
Mas a questão é diferente, porque se tu considera o rendimento básico como medida de redistribuição, tu onde vai buscar o dinheiro para o rendimento básico? Da riqueza social. A riqueza social é feita de salários, renda e lucros. E, portanto, tu também estás a tirar parte deste rendimento dos salários. Se considera o rendimento básico como rendimento primário, tu não pode tirar dos salários, estás a ver onde está, e portanto tem que tirar dos lucros. Esta é, portanto, uma questão política. Desculpa, mas vou calar-me.
Sim, ok. Okay, I get it. Thank you for the. Okay, eu também posso responder em português. Thank you for the clarification. But yeah, so let's go after the profits. I mean, I would be 100% for it. And I mean, one of the most obvious ways to get the money to fund something like this is, I mean, what you're making actually could be interpreted as an argument for UBI out of an argument of open access to the commons, which is, if what social networks are doing is making a profit out of what we decide to make common, namely our lives, and if they are, I mean, providing their service, I mean, allegedly for free, but then it's not for free because they are monetizing our data, then, I mean, and given the fact that they are the companies that benefit the more from wealth accumulation at the top, etc. So let's go after Facebook, let's go after the GAFA, and maybe we'll be able to, however else we frame it, to fund something like this. I know I'm not exactly answering what you asked, bora. Queres dizer mais alguma coisa?
Temos 5 minutes.
Yes.
Have only 5 minutes. Sorry.
Yes, because we ran out of time.
And this is exploration, Gonçalo, this is exploration of your work. Sorry.
No, because there might be a misunderstanding here because I'm waiting for my check, right?
Yes, of course, I have here.
Okay.
Then we can discuss your check later on. So, yeah. Yes, that we came to the end. If Gonçalo wanted to add something for the end, briefly.
No, yeah, I believe I didn't really answer Irene, but yeah, sorry, I'm kind of tired already, and so
Yes,
maybe some other time.
Não é para responder, eu agradeço, era só para pensarmos juntos, não é? Conversarmos.
Obrigado.
Muito obrigada.
Okay. So now I can just thank you all for being here with us today. I'm sure that we all have at least few important takeaways from Gonçalo's lecture and the following discussion to think about in the times to come. So I would just, at the end, invite you to join the following lectures within this cycle of contemporary political topics. So the next one will take place on December 10th, so you can already put in your calendar. The topic will be on populism, and the following one is on January 6th on human rights and migration. So that's more or less all. Have a nice evening. See you on December 10th and stay safe.